Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this meeting of the Royal Society for Asian Affairs. It is a particular pleasure this week to welcome as our guest Victoria Schofield, journalist, author, and long-standing member of this society. Victoria is personally known to many of you, having spoken on many occasions in the past and been a frequent participant in the Society's events. For those whose lives have included close involvement with South Asia, Victoria has been a ubiquitous figure over 40 years, whether it has been in connection with Pakistan, Afghanistan, Kashmir. Her many books, articles and broadcasts have been a constant source of reference, comment and information. Next week, her latest book, The Fragrance of Tears, will be published. It is, as she says herself, a tribute to her friend Benazir Bhutto, and we are lucky enough to have the opportunity to talk to her about both the book and her lifetime involvement with Pakistan. Our normal format on these occasions is to have an extended presentation by a speaker, followed by questions. Today, we are adopting the less formal structure of a conversation, and I have taken the precaution of enlisting into the discussion two people who know a lot more about Pakistan than I do, David Taylor and David Chemist Betty. But I would urge other members of the audience to ask questions too as we go along. And I know that there are many people in the audience who also have a deep familiarity with Pakistan. For anyone who may not be familiar with the technology, you have buttons at the bottom of your screen through which you can write questions. You can, metaphorically, raise your hand if you prefer to speak than to write. Victoria, welcome, and thank you for talking to us today.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you all the listeners. And David KB, thank you for being here.
We're very glad to have you. I mentioned that you describe your forthcoming book as a tribute. I have had the privilege of reading it pre-publication, and the depth and closeness of your relationship with Benazir is very apparent. Given the fate of her father, about which she wrote at the time of his trial and execution, you must have had fears for Benazir's safety from a very early stage in your relationship with her, and possibly even anticipated that at some point you might need to write a book of this kind.
Well, I mean, obviously, I hoped I wasn't going to be writing a book of this kind. As incidentally, when I started the book on her father, I hoped it would not actually have the ending that it did have. I was really recording it as a journalist, recording the events. I think in Benazir's case, what I witnessed was that in a way the region had become a more dangerous place with these suicide attacks, suicide bombs. And clearly when she was going back, there had been threats to her life. And I remember actually, and I think I put it in the book, standing with her in my kitchen one day and saying, you know, you really will take care. And she looked at me almost sort of at a distance. And this was something I heard her say on other occasions. You know, of course, but life and death are in God's hands. And I think towards the end of her life, she became quite fatalistic, that she felt she must go back. She knew she must go back. She hoped for the best. And I think this is something that's also very important, that she prepared for the worst, but she hoped for the best. Obviously, she didn't expect or hope or anticipate being assassinated within 3 months of her return to Pakistan in 2007.
Oh, indeed. And I mean, I wondered what was it that prompted you to write this book now? I mean, there must have been quite strong urges to write things earlier, and I mean, you did, of course, speak and write about her immediately after her death. But what brought on the book?
Well, actually, a combination of things, both emotional and practical. In fact, I had started the book, the record, as it were, in 2007, soon after the first bomb blast, the first attack in October, when she went back to Pakistan after 8 years in exile. And I was on the truck, a number of others were on the truck that was targeted. And as I'd got back into England, I spent a further week there and then came home to England. And I actually felt it was quite a chilly sort of feeling, thinking, you know, supposing that had been successful and that we'd all been wiped out. We were incredibly lucky. And so I just felt I must record for our own children, because I think this is another theme that comes through in my book, is that my children grew up knowing Auntie Benazir, and I grew up knowing her children. Her children grew up knowing me as sort of their English aunt. And so I felt, well, I wanted them to understand more about this friendship. I mean, yes, it was an Oxford friendship, but it had different shades to it, because I'd lived in Pakistan in 78, 79 when her father's appeal was being heard. And so I began to kind of go back and actually put together the 78, 79 years from what I'd already got, diaries and letters and etc. But to be honest, then when she was assassinated, I did write an article, but I just couldn't carry on with it. I found it was all too raw. So I set it aside, and I set it aside actually for a very long time, which comes to the practical answer, because I then got requested to undertake another project, which was absolutely full-time and took me the best part of 10 years, which was writing the official history of the Black Watch, which was a fantastic project. And it was really, you know, you open certain doors in life, especially as a writer, and certain doors are opened for you. And I was extremely happy just setting aside South Asia for a while, although I didn't, because the Black Watch also, they fought all over the world. But in fact, I did other aspects. I did the Mysore Wars and Tipu Sultan and all sorts of other aspects which enhanced my knowledge. And incidentally, the second Black Watch, second battalion of the Black Watch, was the last element of the British Army to leave Karachi in 1948 after partition. So there was a lot of interest in history there. But that really just kept me occupied. And having done that, I then began to reflect, as one does as one gets older. And I thought, well, maybe now is the time I must get on and publish my memoir. And it is published by the same publisher who published Black Watch. And I talked to them and they said, what's your next project, as publishers inevitably do? And that's when I suggested, well, actually, I would like to now write my memoir. And I felt it was time enough. Benazir's children are all adults, my children are all adults. And it's, in a way, it's still my legacy for them. And I have actually dedicated the book to the 6 children.
Thank you. Sorry, Dave.
Go ahead. No.
Come on in. Yeah.
Just, I mean, while we're talking about the assassination, which is obviously, you know, the tearful bit of the book, which I haven't read yet, but Owen Bennett-Jones, who's a journalist colleague of yours, did a 10-part, very, very detailed analysis of the assassination and who did what and what was known, etc. And I think he got some quite privileged information. His assessment, I suppose, was that the military were either complicit or in some way sort of culpable or incompetent. But I don't think he, you know, managed to prove anything conclusively. I just wonder what your views on that were. In that, I think she was led to have said fairly soon before she died that, you know, the military want me out of the way.
Well, again, I mean, you're absolutely right, KB. We can't join the dots. Nobody actually knows. But one of the aspects which Owen did mention in his program, The Assassination, and which I've also referred to in the book, was that when she was speaking in Washington in September, she was addressing the Middle East Institute. And one of the questions was, would she allow, if she became prime minister, would she allow A.Q. Khan, who, as we know, in 2004 had been outed, so to speak, for nuclear proliferation, he was under house arrest at the time in Islamabad, would they allow him to be questioned? And her response was no, by Western governments, but yes, by the IAEA. And that was one of the aspects that Owen thought, and we all wonder, was certainly because at the time, I was actually in Pakistan at the time in 2004, and the, so to speak, sole responsibility which A.Q. Khan had for nuclear proliferation didn't somehow ring true. It was thought that there must have been people within the military who had also known about this, collaborated, benefited, whatever. And this was one reason, and it's a question, it has to end with a question mark, as were there certain people within the military who wanted her out of the way? Because one of the things of Benazir during, especially as she'd grown older, she'd grown into a mature woman, was that she was very much wanting to be her own person. And as we know from having studied the politics of Pakistan, it's very difficult. There are various lobbies, there are various cliques. The army is very, very dominant, whether it's in power, so to speak, as a military dictatorship or a military regime, or whether it's not, whether there's a civilian government. And certainly during her first premiership, she had the military bearing down on her. And so we don't know, but then there are the peculiar aspects of the incompetence, of the washing down of the streets afterwards. And the one person who knew more than anybody about the importance of preserving the crime scene was General Musharraf, because he had been subject to 2 assassination attempts. And that crime scene in Rawalpindi was preserved. And because it was preserved, they were able to identify the would-be assassins. And so, you know, I mean, this is one of the sort of fascinations of reporting on Pakistan, but at the same time, it's one of the frustrations, is that you have theories and there are rumors and there are maybe conspiracy theories, but you can't actually join the dots. But certainly, I myself don't think that it was just the Taliban. Without somebody had to the order.
Yeah. So, despite the awful end, Benazir was Prime Minister of Pakistan for two periods. And I wondered if you could reflect a little bit on her strengths as a political leader, maybe also on her limitations. Somebody who comes, obviously, from the Bhutto dynasty, somebody who's a woman, somebody who's highly educated, somebody who has a clear vision of the future. What do you think the strengths and weaknesses were?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question, David. And again, it's a sad question because neither term of office did she manage to bring to completion. She was ousted after less than 2 years the first time and just 3 years the second time. But if I go back to the her first tenure, which was from late 1988 to 1990, August 1990, one has to cast one's mind back to Pakistan in the 1880s. And Pakistan in the 1880s under military dictatorship was a very, very difficult place to live in. And when she became prime minister, and I mean, there are, I'm sure, many people who can remember that fantastic footage of her taking the oath of office, and she was dressed in a green shalwar kameez with a white dupatta. And there was this feeling of suddenly a breath of fresh air that Pakistan has been returned to civilian government, and a woman is leading, the first woman prime minister. Not, I mean, there were sultans and sultanas in previous Islamic history, but nonetheless, the first female prime minister and the youngest of a Muslim nation. I actually think that we in the West underestimated that achievement because we hadn't quite got our mindset around Islam. I mean, yes, we'd had the Iranian Revolution in 1979, but we hadn't quite understood Islamic culture the way I think we do now, rather better. And it was sort of very much, well, you know, we've got Margaret Thatcher, who of course had recently become prime minister, not recently, in 79. Well, now Pakistan's got Benazir Bhutto. But so you had that fantastic expectation. And for women, it was a wonderful opportunity that they felt, well, now we've got a prime minister and we can ourselves sort of lift that glass ceiling. And one of the assignments I actually did at the time was for the BBC World Service. I made a program on women in Pakistan and what influence Benazir had made. And I remember one of the interviews I did was with Asma Jahangir, fearless human rights lawyer. And she herself said, you know, she can't do everything, but behind her, because she's there, we can begin to operate. But in the same breath, she also said it takes time for opinions to change. But the limitations of Benazir were obviously that you still had the vestiges of military rule. She's still answerable to the military. She had to take the military's choice for president. She had to take the military's choice for foreign minister. And so, although she appeared as a prime minister, she didn't have that same freedom of action that, again, we in the West would think a prime minister would have. In addition to which, there was not the sort of fully functioning, again, if you know, you become prime minister in the UK, you've got a very sort of tight bureaucracy that operates in the civil service. That was not operating. And again, one of the things she said to me, and I think she said it to other interviews, is when I took over, I entered an empty office, both figuratively and literally. And I think, you know, when, as I say, yes, expectations were sky high. And that was also the other problem, because the expectations were so high. Everybody thought that, you know, you wave the magic wand, you've got Pakistan as a democratic country again, and suddenly everything's going to be all right. But that was a difficulty. You know, if you get somebody taking over and your expectations are pretty low, if you don't meet them or you get close to them, then people don't feel quite so disappointed. But with her, because the expectations were so high, there was a huge amount of disappointment because she couldn't achieve everything. And she had really a very short period of time in which to try and achieve what she did. But if one looks sort of at the small print, she began to do things, especially for women. And again, one has to look at the small print because it's not something that's broadcast high. One of women police stations, I mean, small things. Her health initiatives with the polio eradication, all of that, there were things that she was working towards, but she was interrupted. And I think that was also the same for the second government. Yes, she was more mature. She was older. She sort of knew the ropes, but it wasn't an easy ride at all for her, because she constantly had the opposition chipping and chiseling away in the sort of manner of long marches and protests and no confidence motions. She didn't have a sort of clear run thinking I can be there for 4 or 5 years and see what I can achieve.
You mentioned that you were there when she returned to Pakistan, that amazing return. But did you accompany on other political campaigns on the campaign trail?
Well, I did when I was there. I mean, the thing was, as I mentioned earlier, that I was my whole interest in South Asia was because of my friendship with her, but because I was also working as a journalist, I went off and did other stories, and my big focus was working on Kashmir, because at that time the Kashmir insurgency was coming up, and I was working in order to write my first book, actually, on Kashmir. And so I was very conscious not to be kind of like a hanger-on. She was very generous to me. Whenever I went there, I would stay. She would make arrangements for me to stay with her. But at the same time, I was going and doing my own interviews. But she did very kindly include me on certain trips that she did if I was around, if my schedule was there. And I think most memorably was a trip we made to Ziyarat in Baluchistan soon after she'd become Prime Minister for the first time. And that was, she was going to visit Bukti and the leaders there. And so I had a ringside view, and I did see her on a number of occasions like that, both in and out of office.
So I was really wondering how she came across to the crowd, how she was as an orator.
Oh, well, as an orator, I mean, the first time I saw her as an orator actually was before long time ago in 1978, when she was campaigning for her father's life, and she made her first political tour to the Northwest Frontier Province, as was Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And I remember that being incredibly dramatic, because I had been used to seeing her at the Oxford Union, where incidentally she was a very charismatic speaker. I mean, we were all rather dull, and there was this I mean, she had a lot of energy, she had a lot of enthusiasm. I mean, it's difficult when you try and define charisma, but she was very energetic in her manner of speaking. And then I suddenly saw this transferred over to Pakistan in the heat, when she was dressed in a shalwar kameez, and you know, all the audience were mainly male, of course, and she was captivating. And I think one's seen that, you know, through the footage elsewhere. And of course, that famous last speech she gave at Liaquat Bagh, there is a photograph which I've included in the book. It's actually her back view, and you see the entire crowd. And I asked, I've tried to find the transcript of what she was saying, and part of what she was saying, you know, I will save Pakistan. She roared. I mean, she herself, you know, drew strength from speaking to the crowd. She'd sort of start slowly, and then the momentum would build up. And I think it was one of her strengths, but it drained her. It took a lot of energy out of her as well.
Yeah, I think she really definitely inspired the masses with that sort of sense of optimism and vision. And obviously, you know, she was trying to bring in democracy and against the sort of the military, and also fight for moderation against extremism. But her regime was tainted by corruption. How do you see that? Did it taint her as an individual, or could you shift the blame of that corruption entirely to her husband, Asif Ali Zardari, who was known as Mr. 10%? Do you think it was just part of the DNA of Pakistani politics at that time, that it was just inevitable and everybody was at it? What was
well, I mean, tragically, I wouldn't put a time limit on it, David, KB. I think that corruption, not just in Pakistan, but in numerous countries, is endemic. It's part of the system. And I think what is a particular tragedy for Benazir was that she was fighting these allegations, and of course, it did tarnish her reputation. And it was one of the things, when she went back, she wanted to correct and do something positive, because whenever anybody talked about her governments, it was corruption and maladministration. I mean, these were the two charges she was dismissed on. The two charges that, incidentally, Nawaz Sharif was also dismissed on. It's very easy to tarnish your political opponents by talking about corruption and maladministration, and particularly for the Western audience. You know, if you talk about inefficiency or incompetence, nobody's particularly bothered. But if you point the corruption figure, and she was very upset by these allegations, and she fought and did her best to counter them. But it was, you know, almost overwhelming for her. And what she said was that it was sort of there to wear her down psychologically and emotionally, which, you know, she was going from one court case to another court case, etc. But I think it's, you know, as a friend, I was very close, and I continued to support her. I was almost too close, you know, to be able to take a step back from that. And my sympathies were with her in terms of what she was trying to do.
I suppose being a Bhutto in Pakistan is not particularly good for your health. And you know, her father succumbed to execution. Her brother was killed. She was killed. What do you think she would say to Bilawal and the rest of the family? Would she be happy that they're continuing on the line? And do you think Bilawal's heart is in it? Has he got the spirit of his mother to sort of rise up again?
Well, I mean, this is one of the very difficult things, again, which sometimes for us it's difficult to understand in the West, as it were, because, you know, Benazir herself didn't want to go into politics. She was 25 years old when her father was executed. And famously, before she left Oxford when she was 24, she did an interview saying, you know, which was entitled "No Politics for the Premier's daughter who became president," because she became president of the Oxford Union, and she wanted to go into the country's foreign service. But again, when there's a void, and there's a political void, there's this sort of brand of the family. It's the brand of the dynasty. You know, we do have political dynasties in our societies. We have acting dynasties. We have business dynasties. You know, it's not uncommon. But there was this huge expectation that she should step in and take up the mantle and fulfill her father's mission, because he was actually only 51. You know, we all thought he was quite old at the time, but now we think how young he was. So there was that expectation. Of course, when Benazir's assassinated, age 54, there's her son, age 19. And again, it's the brand, the Bhutto, that, you know, you've got to fulfill. So in a way, he was damned if he did and damned if he didn't. It was that void that he was expected to step into his mother's shoes. She did not want him to go into politics, but it's all these people who depend on you because you are essentially the brand. And I know it's very difficult in this country and other countries to understand that, but it's very much the way it is in South Asia. And I remember about 5 years ago, I was asked to speak at a literature festival in Karachi on dynasties and political dynasties. And I thought, oh dear, this is a difficult subject. And I prepared a few remarks and again talked about the brand and acting families and political families and the Nehrus and the Gandhis. And I made this remark, which was actually a throwaway remark. It wasn't part of my prepared remarks. I said, if you want to, you know, stop dynasty, stop assassinating your leaders. And this was sort of in the headlines of the newspaper the next day, because that's the truth of the matter. And I think for Bilal, I think he's still young. He's in his early 30s now. But it was expected of him, and he's risen to it. He's risen to the challenge, you know, but it's still early days. And one obviously hopes that security will be such that he won't be targeted, but one doesn't know. It has the reverse effect, of course, that when security is an issue, you don't interact the same way. I mean, Benazir, as a politician when young, she interacted with the people far more than Bilal was able to do because of this security issue.
Sure.
I just sort of picking up on that sort of theme of sort of family. We have a question from a member of the audience. He says, when we visited Pakistan and Indian Punjab in 2017, one of the things we were told was that whereas there had been a measure of land reform in India in 1953, this had not happened in Pakistan, which remains dominated by about 20 families, of whom the Bhuttos are one, which is why to this day Pakistan is less developed and democratic than India. Did Benazir acknowledge this and have a plan to reduce the influence of the powerful large families in Pakistan?
Well, Michael, she did, but notably her father did, because he undertook land reforms, which of course was not very popular. I mean, you're absolutely right. The traditional saying is that there are 22 families which control Pakistan. But what you've also got to bear in mind, compared with India and the Punjab, you were talking about the Punjab, which of course was partitioned in 1947. That was the only province that was under British authority. The rest of what made up Pakistan was princely states and little kingdoms, so to speak. And so they'd never really benefited, if one can say, from the idea of British rule as the Punjab and India had. It was not the heart of the empire, so to speak. The heart of the empire and the administrative system was in India. You had the outlying western part of Punjab, which Pakistan. I mean, David, of course, knows a lot about this too. And so it was less advanced administratively. It never, as we know, I mean, this is getting into the history of Pakistan, never got off to the same start, because you had Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was the Governor General. He died in 1948. Then you had the Prime Minister, the first Prime Minister, Liaquat Ali Khan, was assassinated in 1951. They never formed a constitution until 1956, first constitution, then finally the 1973 constitution. So I think it's also the geographical nature of Pakistan that has prevented the development. And one Prime Minister there for a short period of time can't make inroads into effectively the establishment and the vested interests, because the vested interests are those who control, not so much one Prime Minister.
And that's a very strong point. I mean, picking up on the vested interest point, and mention has already been made, obviously, of the military role in Pakistan over many years, and that's about as big and powerful a vested interest as there is. In your book, when you are commenting after the refusal of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's appeal, you say that you were too young and naive, your words, to understand the arrogance of a military dictatorship whose intentions were clear to many from the start. Now, you were obviously meaning in that case specifically the question of the fate of Benazir's father, but is that a larger metaphor for the relationship between the civil and military powers in Pakistan, do you think?
Well, that's a tricky question, Michael. I mean, you're probably right. Yes, I think it is. And I actually think it goes back to my other area of supreme interest, which I've mentioned, is the unresolved dispute over Jammu and Kashmir, which has enabled the military to have this very, very dominant role. I think I once wrote an article for the journal Asian Affairs on sort of the military, the institution Pakistanis love to hate, because they dislike the element of military dictatorship and the damage it's done to parliamentary process. At the same time, they love it because it's the guardian of the nation against India, and it is sort of there in order to ensure the safety of that part of Jammu and Kashmir, which Pakistan controls, namely Gilgit-Baltistan and the narrow strip of land which Pakistanis, as we know, call Azad Jammu and Kashmir. But if one takes a real step back as a historian and looks at Pakistan, I think the fact that, as I say, it never really got off to a political safe start. The first military dictatorship was in 1958, and it lasted for over 10 years. And the fact that it's never managed to resolve its relationship with India. And I actually, as the older I've got, the more strongly I feel about this, because it is absolutely tragic that these countries, they'll always be neighbors, have been unable to resolve their relationship. And it's got worse, it's got more dangerous. But it's defined the character of Pakistan and given this enormous predominance to the military, which is really unnecessary for a country when they've got poverty, developmental issues, education, etc. I mean, yes, you had the subsequent events in Afghanistan and to the west, but the main focus of the Pakistan army has always been, so to speak, to fight India. And I think this is one of the tragedies, looking back at the whole 70 plus years of Pakistan's existence.
Indeed. I mean, you remind me that at the time that India and Pakistan both conducted their first nuclear tests, I was the head of the department in the Foreign Office that was responsible for this particular area of policy. And immediately after the Indians tested, we pleaded with Pakistan not to test. On the basis that here was a huge opportunity for them to gain international stature and respect for restraint when everybody knew they had the capability. There was no doubt about that. And we felt at the time that there were people in Pakistan who recognised the strength of that and the potential benefit. But I imagine that in a sort of public relations perspective within Pakistan, to have failed to respond to the Indian tests would have been pretty fatal to the military's reputation. Does that seem like a
Yes, I think so. I mean, Nawaz Sharif was prime minister at the time, and if you recall, Michael, in the book, there is a very interesting interview which Benazir does in the 1990s when this question is put to her by a journalist, and she says, no, it's much better to act coy. Those are her exact words. Sorry. I actually turned my phone off, but it hasn't. Oh, right. Apologies, viewers. That was her idea in the early 90s. Much better to act coy because you then, you can sort of have your cake and eat it too. But I think at the time, fast forwarding to 1998, the groundswell of public opinion was far too great, and for the military to suddenly flex its muscles. And it became the India, they couldn't look at the bigger picture. It just became the India-Pakistan relationship that was foremost. And Pakistan, in a way, had to detonate. I was also one of those, was hoping they wouldn't. I thought that they actually could demand assistance for resolution of Kashmir, etc. But that certainly, it was, essentially it's a hubris element, and that does dominate in those societies.
Yes, I think there's a culture actually bred into the military in both India and Pakistan of what they call quid pro quo, QPQ. I mean, you do something to me, I'll do something back to you. It's almost automatic in the DNA of the psychology of the military. They cannot just hold back and try and maintain the moral high ground. They have to retaliate.
Yeah. No, I mean, and it's the same. It's going on now over the line of control.
Yeah,
they can't
absolutely.
not desist. If one side fires, the other side will fire.
Almost every day.
They cannot not fire. And it's one of the, it's as I say, it's a bigger tragedy. And I think, again, going back, to Benazir specifically, one of the greatest, most exciting times was in December 1988, when she'd just become prime minister. And there's a fabulous photograph I've got in the book of her with Rajiv Gandhi. And there was this real expectation that these children of the post-partition era, both of whom had had antecedents, their respective parents had signed Shimla, that they could actually do something. And they were both very keen to do something to diffuse any potential tensions, and did indeed start discussions over the occupied Siachen Glacier. But again, the political compulsions, and I felt this very much, it was not up. You always think it's up to the two leaders, but it was the political compulsions which pulled them apart. Rajiv lost the next election, then he was assassinated. And so that moment in time, which you had in December 88, and then he returned again on an official visit in 1989, that window of opportunity was lost. And it's never really been recreated. They've had different manifestations, but that expectation, that wonderful enthusiasm that these people can set aside their differences and move forward, went.
Yeah, I've got a question here from William Crawley, taking you back to Benazir's father. He says, William says, in public, I think that Benazir never voiced any criticism of her father's political career and record, rather as Aung San Suu Kyi has never expressed any criticisms of her father. Did she ever express to you privately any reservations about Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's career?
It's a really difficult question, because if she did express them privately, then they must remain private. But I think she learned from the situation, and she also learned from her own mistakes. And there was an interview I did with her, I think it was in 2000 or 2001, where we were talking about criticism and opposition. And she made it very clear. She said, I've put the quotation in the book. She said, I didn't used to like criticism, but then now I have learned that that is the plurality of the system. So she was learning, and she did learn. She observed what happened both in terms of what her father did and also in her earlier administration.
Could I turn the conversation to a rather more general area? And Pakistan was founded in 1947, and Jinnah, of course, had a very clear vision of what he wanted the country to be, but there have been many competing visions. You know, Zia had a vision. One may not like it, but there was a vision. And other people have similarly expressed secular visions, religious visions. Can you say something about what Benazir Bhutto's vision of Pakistan was, and particularly perhaps the role of Islam within it?
Well, she argued very forcefully on numerous occasions that Islam was compatible with parliamentary democracy, because there was this feeling that Islam wasn't. And, you know, if you had an Islamic sort of theocratic state, you couldn't have a democratic state. Her vision, and again, it was influenced obviously by her upbringing, was against the military and against forces of what she called extremism. And I think, again, from her experience of being in Pakistan in the 80s, was seeing the danger of having a lack of accountability with a military dictatorship meant that sort of you took as your allies the forces of extremism, and you were prepared to deal with them. And so her vision was very much trying to get back to, I think, what she regarded as the heyday of the best parts of her father's government, which was a civilian democracy. I mean, again, one can go into minor details and say this wasn't working and this wasn't right, etc., etc. But the idea was she was very much influenced by our parliamentary democracy and the elections, and that you could have free elections and fair elections. And that was the sort of idea that she wanted to sort of have translated over to Pakistan, at the same time as realizing that this was, you know, again, it's incredibly difficult. You don't wave a magic wand and suddenly have a democratic country. It has to be built, and it has to be built on. And so you've also got to deal with what your sort of vote bank is and what your populace is. And of course, in Pakistan, as we know, the majority of people don't have the sort of higher education. You know, you're dealing with an illiterate population. And therefore, you've got to sort of have other ways to transmit these democratic ideals, where most people will vote for whoever will pay their wages. I mean, that's sort of idea. But that was her vision. But in addition to which, she was passionately wanting to support women. And I think what I found always very charming about her was how encouraging she was to other women in Pakistan, other women politicians, that she would, you know, want them, you know, there are people in politics at this moment in time, thanks to Benazir, because she said, oh, you know, she'd pick up people who were educated, who were able to speak fluently and sort of charismatically themselves, and she would encourage them, because, as you know, I mean, the Pakistan system is they have allocated seats for women. I mean, it's very backward, if you want, in terms of just thinking how, you know, you can have XYZ be a member of parliament in the UK, whether they're a man or a woman. And that was something she did care about. And as I say, I think it was a rather charming characteristic that she had. It wasn't just that she was the woman and, you know, she was quite happy operating as the sort of the sole woman. She was very keen to have other women. A little bit like when, I mean, just on an absolute personal note, but when I became president of the union after her, in succession, she was the third female president of the Oxford Union, and I was the fourth in direct succession, which that had not ever happened before. I mean, there hadn't been that many women anyway. And you could have thought, well, she'd think, oh, well, she wants to be the last female president of the union for a while. But she was so encouraging to me that I should also become president. You know, that's a little characteristic. And these are the sort of things I wanted to describe in my book that were, you know, might be unexpected. You might have thought she'd, as I say, just think, well, you know, I'll hog the limelight for a while. But she didn't.
Could I feed in a question here from David Loyne, which is taking us geographically northwards rather than east and south? David asks, could you talk about her relations with ISI and their support for militancy in Afghanistan? It always looked to me as if Nawaz was more willing to confront them.
Oh, that's interesting, David. She inherited, this is one thing she did inherit in 1988, was the ISI's policy in Afghanistan. It was initiated by General Zia, and that was made very clear to me when I actually interviewed the head of the ISI, Hamid Gul, in 1989, that it was Zia's brainchild. And this was an area where Benazir didn't have much ability to reverse what was going on. I mean, she had to make do with the policy that was already in place. I would actually argue that Nawaz Sharif might have done more to reverse it, but certainly didn't. And he equally followed that policy when he was prime minister. And you had the continuing support of the Taliban during the Nawaz Sharif period.
Staying with sort of internal Pakistani politics for a moment, Geordie Burnett Stewart asks, Pakistan, unlike India, has never had much socialism in its politics. Can you comment in relation to Benazir's own instincts?
Well, again, we get back to the control of the 22 families. And again, we get back to what Bhutto tried. I mean, he was very much influenced by again, we've got to put it in the context of the 70s because situations have changed and changed again. But he was influenced by the Shah's White Revolution and, his own introduction of socialism. I mean, you can, and the Pakistan People's Party manifesto was essentially a socialist manifesto. First time ever you'd had this socialist manifesto. You've got to look at what's gone before. But again, and you can criticize how it was enacted, but its intention was to broaden the voting populace within Pakistan. And it's to this day why you have the sort of the Pakistani people supporting the Pakistan People's Party, because they might not have fulfilled all their promises, but they made the people feel that they felt empowered, that they did actually have a voice. That was one of the things that Zulfikar Bhutto did. He put on a shalwar kameez. What Pakistanis were used to was men in suits in drawing rooms, and Bhutto put on the shalwar kameez and campaigned, and that was Benazir's attitude as well, that she was going to not be afraid. She was going out to campaign. But as with all aspects of Pakistan's politics, either these policies are cut short, they're sabotaged, people don't actually want them, they talk the talk, but they don't actually walk the walk. And it's never really managed to get off the ground because it goes back to vested interest. When the power is controlled by the vested interest, of which the army is one very big dominant vested interest, the actual leveling out is not done so assiduously.
Victoria, on the Pakistan People's Party, you mentioned there, I mean, they have almost a sort of block vote in Sindh. Through this sort of kinship network and almost going back to the sort of feudal hold that the landlords have on Sindh, and I don't see that changing, but they seem to be always struggling to sort of maintain themselves as a national party. Could you say anything about how Benazir managed to do that, and whether you think that they're likely to be able to rise again, as it were, to become a national party, not just a provincial party in Sindh?
Well, I mean, this is one of the supreme ironies, is that the PPP was a national party under Bhutto. I mean, again, one can talk about failings, but it was a national party. And particularly in the most populous province, which was the PPP, which was the Punjab, sorry. But that was one of the aspects that Zia worked assiduously to really break. It was to break the power of the PPP, and that was why he was fostering this if you look at the history of Pakistan, these Islamic parties all came up during the Zia eras. And, you know, he obviously, Nawaz Sharif was a protege of Zia at the time and the revamped sort of Muslim League. And so gradually the PPP shrunk back to its cultural, natural sort of linguistic roots, if you like, into Sindh. But it was not established as a Sindhi party. It was established as a national party. Again, the character of Pakistan, the Baluchis have always had a particular narrative themselves, as has the inhabitants of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And what Bhutto Sr. managed to do in '73 was to get this constitution, which was unanimously agreed by all the provinces, as more as a federation. I would say that that's what the idea was, that this should be, rather than bringing all power to the centralized. But then inevitably what you've had is the dominance of the Punjab and the PPP being really overtaken, because even within you know, the Muslim League, you've got the same camaraderie operating, that you've got that people will vote with the people, you know, from the village that they know. And it's been very difficult for the PPP to get back into the Punjab, or indeed to make the relevant alliances in Baluchistan and KPK. At the same time, you talk about PPP being the Sindhi party, but you've got the opposition of the MQM. You see, and they've always, I mean, when Benazir went into power, she had to do a coalition with the MQM, because the Mahajir party, which you know, was formed really to represent those Urdu-speaking Pakistanis who'd come over from India, but they weren't culturally Sindhi. So, you know, like so many countries, you're fighting against linguistics with culture, with upbringing. In answer to whether it will get back again, I mean, that's what they're working towards, but everything has become more, you know, what I would call sub-nationalistic. I mean, all over the world, there's a great attachment to culture and nationalism than looking at the broader picture and the more federal picture. And I think Pakistan operates best as a federation, because you do have these very distinct areas, which, you know, quite frankly, don't have that much in common. They don't necessarily, I mean, yes, Urdu is the common language that they're likely to speak, but, you know, the Baluchis consider themselves very different from, say, for example, the Sindhis. Likewise, the Punjabis. Punjab is 2/3 of Pakistan's population. They've always felt very sort of dominant, and then they've got this sort of link, you know, crossing over with having been part of a larger Punjabi-speaking area. And then, you know, you throw into that mix the inhabitants of Gilgit-Baltistan and Azad Jammu and Kashmir, who linguistically and culturally are very different.
William Crawley is not to be put off,
Okay,
and has reframed his question.
Oh, okay.
Let me read you his latest version. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was responsible as Prime Minister for declaring the Ahmadis non-Muslims. Did Benazir ever express reservations about this decision? And if privately, 30 years after her death, would it be wrong to reveal it?
It's 13 years, no, not 30 years.
30, yeah, we do.
William is right. Benazir was very loyal. And again, it's very, I mean, he will appreciate in a South Asian environment, it's very difficult to suddenly come out with statements because it would become headline news. Benazir says, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what I will say is that she was always rethinking. And the most classic example is that she brought Pakistan back into the Commonwealth, and her father had taken Pakistan out of the Commonwealth. And so I think that's a very clear indication that she didn't always agree with what her father had done. And she made it very clear that what he did at that time, you know, might have been appropriate at that time in mind. And so I think, you know, there were many things unfinished that she could have done and potentially would have done. Many people criticize her, of course, for the adultery laws, and one has to look at the again the small print that she required a majority. So it's not just the one person. You have to carry the majority with you, and the majority were not always with her in the respect of these aspects. And so it's quite possible that had she wanted to do anything in relation to the Ahmadis, she would have been outvoted again, because she had the establishment up against her. And I suppose what I would myself end on is that one of the greatest tragedies of her assassination, aged 54, is that we'll never know what more she could have done and what she would have done. And I think this is what I feel most sad about, because she had learned in the 30s and 40s, and in the 50s, I think she was going back to Pakistan to really try and make a difference. And, you know, the finite 1953 to 2007 date of birth and date of death is the sum total of what we know about Benazir Bhutto. We'll never know what she might have achieved, but she really did want to achieve more than just, you know, what she'd done to date. She wanted to make a difference, and who knows in what direction that difference might have led her.
That is with a broadcast journalist's impeccable sense of timing, Victoria. You have brought us to exactly, I think, the right note to finish on at exactly the right time. So thank you for that. It always makes my job easier. But thank you very much as well for a fantastic discussion. It's been fascinating. There are still one or two questions out there which we will sadly have to leave for now, but really warmest thanks. It's been very good to have you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you, David and KB, and thank you, Michael. Thank you, listeners.
Very welcome.
I've appreciated it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I will just say a brief word before everybody goes about our next talk, which is in 2 weeks' time, when Owen Matthews will be also, as it happens, talking about a book, but one that came out more than a year ago now, a book about Richard Sorge, who was Stalin's principal spy in Japan during the Second World War. And we will hear from him at the same time on Wednesday in 2 weeks. But for now, thank you all very much indeed. We look forward to seeing you again in a fortnight.
Thank you.